Was building an empire the greatest thing Russia ever did, or the greatest mistake Russia ever made? That question sits at the center of Jeffrey Hosking's Russia and the Russians, A History, and it is not rhetorical. Hosking has a clear answer, and it runs against the grain of how Russians have usually been taught to think about themselves. The empire, he argues, did not express Russian civilization. It stunted it. Every generation that poured its energy into maintaining and expanding that vast dominion across 11 time zones was a generation that failed to build the courts, the civic associations, the property rights, and the rule of law that might have allowed ordinary Russians to live secure and flourishing lives. The Romanovs and the Soviets built a state of extraordinary territorial reach and extraordinary internal fragility, a colossus that kept winning wars and losing the peace. Jeffrey Hosking spent his career at University College London as one of Britain's leading historians of Russia. Russia and the Russians traces that argument from the earliest East Slavic settlements to the chaotic Russia of Boris Yeltsin, the most coherent narrative of Russian history available in English. What makes the book unusual is its opening. Hosking does not begin with tsars or manifestos. He begins with soil and weather. The growing season in the core agricultural zone was short to the point of brutality. In Vologda province, reliable summer, the period when grain could be counted on to grow and ripen, lasted roughly 6 weeks. At either end there could be frosts that destroyed everything. And because the margin was so thin, a bad year consumed the seed grain needed for the following year, making the next year worse. Failure cascaded. Against this background, the social arrangements of the Russian peasant community look less like cultural eccentricities and more like rational adaptations to extreme risk. The commune, the mir, meaning both peace and community, developed collective mechanisms for survival, periodic redistribution of land strips, the custom of pomochi, emergency mutual aid, where neighbors rebuilt a burnt-out hut without expectation of repayment, joint responsibility for tax obligations. These institutions ensured against disaster. They also discouraged individual enterprise and long-term planning. You do not improve land you may not farm next year. 2 concepts from this culture are essential for everything that follows. The first is pravda, truth, but also justice, morality, the accumulated wisdom of the community about how life ought to be conducted. The criterion for any decision was that it accord with pravda. When a Tsar behaved according to pravda, he was legitimate. When he manifestly did not, the appropriate response was to find the true Tsar. This explains the recurring phenomenon of pretenders in Russian history, not mere opportunism, but a genuinely held belief that rightful authority existed somewhere and had been usurped. The second is volia, a word often translated as freedom but meaning something entirely different from Western liberal freedom. Volia is the absence of all constraint, the freedom of the open steppe, the right to ride out into the wild field without submission to anyone. It is nomadic freedom, not civic freedom. It explains, among much else, the extraordinary speed of Russian penetration into Siberia, driven not by organized state expansion but by individuals fleeing serfdom, escaping obligations, unable to bear the constraints of settled community life. And underlying everything, Hosking identifies a structure that persists across all periods, the patron-client network. Russian political power, at every level from the village to the Kremlin, has operated not through abstract law but through personal bonds of dependence. A powerful patron distributes resources and protection, clients supply loyalty and service. This structure is resilient and deeply resistant to the rule of law, because law threatens the patron's discretion, which is the source of his power. It reassembles after every revolution, wearing new institutional clothing. Kievan Rus, built at Kiev on the Dnieper trade routes, had features that would not survive its collapse. The Vesh, the city assembly, gave urban populations genuine power, electing princes, deciding on war and peace. Prince Vladimir's conversion to Christianity in 988 brought Byzantine civilization, literacy, law, architecture, diplomatic connection, into the Slavic world. His son Yaroslav the Wise married his children into the royal houses of France, Hungary, and Norway. For a brief moment, Kiev was a European great power. What it could not do was solve the succession problem. The Rurikid dynasty divided its branches across many cities, each competing for the prestige of Kiev. The assemblies could not transcend this fragmentation. When the Mongols came, Rus was fatally divided. But the structural weakness was already visible. The succession principle generated perpetual competition among the Rurikid dynasty's many branches. When the Mongols came in 1237, Rus was divided. The Mongol invasion is handled with precision. Cities were stormed, populations massacred or enslaved. The destruction was real. But Hosking also complicates the standard picture. Trade revived faster than the chronicles suggest, and the Mongol postal relay system actually improved communications across the heartland. The decisive damage was political. The Vesh assemblies lost their functions, taxation, military recruitment, all now handled by the Mongols or by princes acting as their agents. The princes had to travel to Serai and kneel before the Khan to receive authorization for their rule. The paradox Hosking identifies here is striking. The institution that benefited most from Mongol rule was the Orthodox Church. The Mongols gave it a charter exempting it from tribute and forced labor. While the secular world was humiliated, the Church prospered. More importantly, with the princes fragmented and the Veshes silenced, the Church became the one institution capable of speaking for all of Rus. Orthodoxy fused with national identity in the crucible of conquest. Moscow's rise followed through patience and cunning, using its role as tribute collector for the Mongols to accumulate resources, buying and inheriting neighboring principalities, persuading the church hierarchy to make Moscow its seat. When Ivan III formally refused Mongol tribute in 1480, he appropriated the cultural inheritance of Byzantium, fallen to the Ottomans in 1453, by marrying the niece of the last Byzantine emperor and adopting the double-headed eagle. The idea of Moscow as the Third Rome began to circulate. The Tsar was simultaneously Khan and Christian emperor, and never resolved the tension. Empires rarely need logical consistency. The reign of Ivan IV, the Terrible, though the Russian Grozny means or inspiring, contains the greatest expansion and the greatest self-destruction of early Muscovite history. The conquest of Kazan in 1552 was the first annexation of a sovereign Muslim state into the Russian Empire, a turning point in the Eurasian balance of power. The Astrakhan Khanate fell in 1556. The Kazakh Yermak crossed the Urals in 1581 and began the penetration of Siberia that would carry Russian sovereignty to the Pacific. Then came the Oprichnina. In 1565, Ivan divided his realm, placing part under direct personal control enforced by black-robed agents who carried a dog's head and broom at their saddlebows, symbols of their function to sniff out and sweep away enemies. Years of executions without legal process followed. The ancient city of Novgorod was sacked in 1570 on suspicion of disloyalty, thousands killed, some thrown from a bridge and held under with poles. Hosking frames this not as individual pathology but as structural consequence. The Muscovite state needed centralized authority to hold together a vast territory, but had no institutional mechanisms for containing that authority. Without independent courts, a nobility capable of organized resistance, or a church willing to confront the Tsar, Metropolitan Philip tried, and was murdered. There was nothing between the autocrat's will and its implementation. Terror was the instrument of governance when institutions failed. The time of troubles that followed Ivan's death, 6 or 7 Tsars in succession, Polish forces in the Kremlin, famine killing perhaps a third of the population, was resolved not by dynastic continuity but by civic mobilization. The merchant Kuzma Minin and Prince Dmitry Pozharsky raised a militia, expelled the Poles, and convened an assembly that elected Mikhail Romanov as Tsar in 1613. Peter the Great accepted his inheritance with terrifying energy. He traveled incognito to Holland and England in 1697, working in dockyards, inspecting factories, visiting the Royal Society, and came back convinced that Russia's entire social structure had to be rebuilt. What followed was comprehensive and coercive in equal measure. Nobles were ordered to shave their beards. The table of ranks created a ladder where promotion depended on performance, not birth. The church patriarchate was abolished and replaced by a body supervised by a lay official. A new capital was built at St. Petersburg on marshland at the Neva, constructed by conscripted laborers at enormous human cost. The Northern War against Sweden, culminating in the crushing victory at Poltava in 1709, made Russia a European great power. An Austrian ambassador remarked that Russia would henceforth be the most dangerous neighbor that Europe has ever known. Hosking's verdict is characteristically double-edged. Peter achieved the strategic objective. A British ambassador observed that Russia could no longer be regarded as a distant glimmering star but had become a great planet that has obtruded itself into our system. But the methods reinforced the very pathologies they were supposed to cure. The service state became more demanding, not less. Serfdom was tightened rather than loosened, because the empire needed taxes and recruits. The resources extracted from the countryside left nothing for civil institutions. Potentially autonomous institutions, in local justice, philanthropy, religious life, were either crushed or subordinated to the state apparatus. Peter created a European facade over an Asian structure of coerced mobilization, and he entrenched the central paradox of Russian modernization. Every attempt to import European institutions required intensifying the very methods of compulsion that European institutions were supposed to replace. Both the facade and the structure proved remarkably durable. Catherine the Great, who came to power in 1762 after deposing her husband, was the most intellectually interesting ruler Russia produced. She read Voltaire, corresponded with Diderot, and commissioned the Hermitage's first art collection. She also, in Hosking's judgment, ultimately failed as a reformer. Her power base was the noble landowners, and she could not alienate them. The Charter of Nobility of 1785 freed nobles from mandatory state service while confirming their absolute authority over their serfs, an authority by now virtually unlimited. Pugachev's rebellion of 1773 to 1775, in which a Cossack claiming to be the dead Tsar Peter III gathered an army of Cossacks, serfs, factory workers, and non-Russian peoples, Bashkirs, Tatars, Kazakhs, swept across the Volga region burning estates and killing landowners. At its peak the movement threatened Kazan and looked toward Moscow. Catherine had to commit regular army forces to suppress it. Pugachev was captured, exhibited in an iron cage as he was transported to Moscow, and publicly executed. The execution solved the immediate problem. The underlying conditions that had produced the rebellion, unlimited noble power over serfs, with no legal recourse, continued for another 86 years. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861 freed 23 million people. But the terms required redemption dues payable over 49 years, and freed serfs remained members of the commune with collective tax responsibility. The commune retained the authority to restrict a member's freedom to leave. Legal personhood came without full civic participation. The reform was genuinely transformative and genuinely incomplete, and the incompleteness generated another generation of frustration. The populist movement of the 1860s and 1870s expressed idealistic young Russians' response to the peasant majority's continued subjection. Students went to the countryside to teach and agitate. The peasants were mostly suspicious and sometimes turned them over to the police. The most radical faction, the People's Will, concluded that only political violence could break the deadlock. On March 1, 1881, they succeeded in killing Alexander II with a bomb. The savage irony, the Tsar had that morning signed a decree authorizing a consultative assembly that might have opened a path toward constitutional monarchy. His successor shelved the plan and intensified repression instead. 19th-century Russia produced an extraordinary intellectual debate. The Westernizers argued that Russia must absorb European liberal principles. The Slavophiles insisted that Russia's orthodox communal tradition was superior to European individualism and needed no supplement. The state's own answer came from Nicholas I's minister Uvarov: orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, claiming the autocrat embodied the Russian national spirit and that Russia needed nothing from the West. The formula served as official ideology for the rest of the century. The revolution of 1905 was triggered by military humiliation in the Russo-Japanese War and crystallized by Bloody Sunday, January 9, 1905, when troops fired on a peaceful procession of workers and their families carrying a petition to the Winter Palace. The petition, drafted by the priest Georgy Gapon, asked for an 8-hour working day, the right to strike, and an elected constituent assembly. The shooting killed more than 100 people on the spot. Within days the revolution had spread across the empire: strikes, peasant seizures of noble estates, the naval mutiny on the battleship Potemkin. The October Manifesto that ended the crisis promised civil liberties and a legislative Duma. But the fundamental laws of 1906 preserved the emperor's power to dismiss the government and dissolve the Duma. The electoral law was rewritten in 1907 to reduce peasant representation. Russia was simultaneously an embryonic constitutional monarchy and a police state, and neither could defeat the other. World War I broke the equilibrium. Catastrophic casualties, collapsed food supply, and a quartermaster system of medieval incompetence accumulated until the system gave way. In February 1917, bread riots in Petrograd turned revolutionary when the garrison troops refused to fire on the crowds. Within days the autocracy had simply dissolved. Nicholas II, returning from military headquarters by train, was diverted to a siding at Pskov, where generals and Duma representatives told him it was over. He signed his abdication in a railway carriage, handing power to a line of successors who almost immediately refused it. 300 years of Romanov rule ended not in battle but in a railway car on a provincial siding. The provisional government's fatal decision was to continue the war. Lenin, returning from exile in a German-sealed train, offered peace, land, and bread. In October 1917 the Bolsheviks seized power, not through popular insurrection but through disciplined seizure of key installations at a moment of maximum state weakness. Hosking is blunt: this was a coup by a party of professional revolutionaries, not a workers' revolution. The civil war that followed was catastrophe on a scale that resists comprehension: multiple armies, foreign interventions, famine, epidemic, industrial production collapsing to levels below any previous recorded low. Hosking's account of the Whites' failure is particularly sharp. They were not defeated primarily because of Bolshevik military superiority but because they offered nothing the peasant majority, 80% of the population, wanted. Their commanders distrusted politics as beneath a soldier's dignity and had no agrarian program. Promising only to restore the old order, they lost the countryside. The Bolsheviks won by combining merciless food requisitioning with genuine ideological conviction. The true believers who were convinced that theirs was the wave of the future provided an energy and morale that the cynical white commanders could not match. Once the Civil War ended, the Central Soviet paradox was immediately visible. Having destroyed the old patron-client networks, the Bolsheviks rebuilt them from scratch in communist clothing. The party cell system, the Commissar network, trusted subordinates from the Civil War generation, within a Marxist framework. The same structures of personal dependence that had organized Russian life since the beginning were reconstituted wholesale. Stalin's rise after Lenin's death in 1924 was inseparable from his control of the nomenklatura, the list of positions requiring Central Party approval, covering every institution in Soviet life. He used this to place loyal clients and block rivals, the patron-client network rebuilt from the top down, on a scale never before attempted. The collectivization of 1929 to 1933 destroyed the traditional commune. The famine of 1932 to 1933, killing between 5 and 7 million people, was not crop failure, it was the direct result of impossible grain quotas, prohibition on peasants keeping any food, and internal passports preventing the starving from moving to cities. The Great Terror of 1937 to 1938 then eliminated anyone who might form an alternative power center: old Bolsheviks, the Red Army High Command, regional party leaders, cultural figures. The total executed probably exceeded 750,000. World War II killed somewhere between 25 and 27 million Soviet citizens. Hosking's focus is not on heroism and sacrifice but on what the war revealed structurally: the Red Army was initially catastrophically unprepared because Stalin had executed most of its experienced commanders. Recovery required giving frontline commanders practical autonomy that was formally impossible in a Stalinist structure. The population fought with genuine ferocity, but often in spite of the regime rather than because of it. Khrushchev's denunciation of the cult of personality in 1956 caused an earthquake in international communism but solved nothing structurally. He demolished Stalin's legitimacy without building anything to replace it. The Thaw-produced Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, published in 1962 in the journal Novy Mir, perhaps the moment when Soviet literature spoke most directly to Soviet reality. But the thaw depended entirely on Khrushchev's personal sponsorship. When he was deposed in 1964, it was switched off. The Brezhnev decades from 1964 to 1982 were, in Hosking's telling, the patron-client system in its most naked post-Stalin form. Regional party bosses built personal empires. The elite accumulated visible privileges, special stores, dachas, imported goods, superior medical care that set them visibly apart from the population they claimed to serve. The ideology claimed a society marching toward communism. The actual society ran on blat, informal exchange through connections, on terms recognizable in any Russian village a century earlier. Cultural dissent found its channels. The underground literature of the samizdat, self-published manuscripts passed hand to hand, preserved the critical tradition that official publishing suppressed. The singer Vladimir Vysotsky, whose gravelly voice sang of everyday absurdity and the gap between official rhetoric and lived experience, became one of the most beloved figures in Soviet culture without ever being permitted to release a proper album. His funeral in 1980 drew enormous spontaneous crowds in Moscow. The regime that could not permit him to publish while alive could not prevent the grief that attended his death. By Brezhnev's death in 1982, most party members had largely stopped believing what they publicly professed. The gap between official language and lived reality had become so wide that maintaining the pretense required constant, exhausting effort, and everyone knew that everyone else knew it was pretense. This was the civilization that Gorbachev inherited. Gorbachev's decision to close that gap through glasnost, openness, was the choice that undid the system. Chernobyl, in April 1986, dramatized the cost of information management, the largest nuclear disaster in history, initially met with denial while the population of Pripyat lived in elevated radiation for 2 days without being told. Gorbachev later described the disaster as having shed light on many of the sicknesses of our system as a whole, the concealing or hushing up of accidents and other bad news, irresponsibility and carelessness, slipshod work. Once glasnost began to spread beyond individual abuses to systemic ones, it could not be controlled. By 1988, literary magazines were publishing Pasternak and Grossman, and historians were openly discussing the famine of 1932 to 1933 and the executions of 1937 to 1938. The Soviet past was being dismantled in public. The fall of communist governments across Central and Eastern Europe in 1989 was the decisive external shock. When crowds gathered at the Berlin Wall on November 9 and no one fired on them, when it became clear Soviet troops would not intervene, the legitimating myth dissolved in an evening. If the vanguard of the socialist camp could simply walk away, what exactly was the Soviet project for? Inside the USSR, glasnost had released forces Gorbachev could no longer direct. Peoples who had been silenced for generations, Ukrainians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Armenians, Georgians, began demanding their histories, their languages, and eventually their independence. The August coup by conservative hardliners, an attempt to arrest Gorbachev and reverse the reforms, collapsed within 3 days when it became evident that the army would not fire on civilians. Boris Yeltsin, standing on a tank outside the Moscow Parliament building, became the symbol of whatever Russia might become next. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of a country that no longer existed. The hammer and sickle came down from the Kremlin. What went up was the tricolor of pre-revolutionary Russia, without the double-headed eagle. The Soviet Union had passed into history. What came next was a compressed demonstration of how hard it is to build civil society and market institutions from the ruins of a state that had systematically destroyed both for 7 decades. Price liberalization in January 1992 produced a 400% increase in the first month, wiping out decades of accumulated savings overnight. Privatization of state enterprises transferred industrial assets to politically connected insiders, the oligarchs, at prices far below their value. In October 1993, the power struggle between Yeltsin and the Supreme Soviet, the holdover parliament from the Soviet era, ended with army tanks firing high-explosive rounds into the parliament building on live television. The White House, as it was known, burned for hours in central Moscow. CNN broadcast the footage to the world. At least 144 people died in the fighting. Unofficial estimates ran considerably higher. This was not a coup reversed by democratic resistance. It was a democracy's elected president shelling his own legislature. Whatever remained of idealism about Russia's transition had been incinerated along with the building. When the December 1993 elections produced a strong showing for Vladimir Zhirinovsky's Liberal Democrats, free vodka, restored empire, conquered India, racial hierarchy, the result was not an aberration. Russians who had been promised transformation and received chaos, poverty, and national humiliation were looking for the strongman who would make things simple again. Hosking closes before Putin. But the argument built across 500 pages explains the context that made Putin possible and popular. A society whose civil institutions had been enfeebled at every stage, from the medieval suppression of the Veche to the Soviet destruction of all independent organization, was structurally unable to sustain liberal democracy when those requirements were suddenly imposed from above. The patron-client networks reasserted themselves in post-Soviet form. The oligarchs were just the largest-scale expression of a logic that extended all the way down to the local official demanding a bribe to process a form. This is the book's ultimate argument, and it is a sobering one. The problem of Russian governance is not simply the problem of bad rulers. It is the problem of a society whose development at every level was consistently distorted by the needs of empire, a society that produced brilliant artists, scientists, and military commanders, and that failed, generation after generation, to build the mundane, unglamorous institutions that make a population capable of governing itself. Russia and the Russians is the most penetrating single account of Russian history in the English language, the one that most successfully explains rather than merely narrates how a society arrived at where it is. Its limitations are the inherent costs of single-volume scope. Some periods compress, and non-Russian peoples appear primarily in relation to Russian policy rather than as subjects of their own histories. A reader wanting the full story of the Soviet Union's non-Russian peoples will need to look elsewhere. For anyone who wants to understand why the same patterns keep recurring, the cycles of reform and reaction, the patron-client structures reassembling in new institutional clothing, the gap between imperial ambition and civic poverty, this is where to begin. The book does not predict the future, but it provides the vocabulary for understanding it.